Have you ever held a question in your heart so old it feels like it belongs to the dust of stars? A question not of science or of politics, but of survival. How does a story, a single idea, withstand the crushing weight of empires, the fires of persecution, and the silent grinding erosion of time itself? This is not a story about a religion as you might know it. It is the story of a people, a covenant, and an idea that has been etched into the soul of humanity. It is a story that begins in the desert sun and winds through the darkest corridors of history. A story that has been whispered in ghettos, debated in academies, and cried out in both agony and exultation. It is the story of Judaism. And what is Judaism? To some, it is the mysterious root from which two of the world's largest faiths, Christianity and Islam, would later grow. To others, it is a complex tapestry of laws and traditions, of ancient texts that seem to argue with themselves across the centuries. But to a small group of people scattered across the globe, yet bound by an invisible thread, it is something more. It is memory. It is a homeland carried not on a map, but in the heart. Tonight, we are not just looking at history, we are looking for a soul. We journey back, past the headlines and the conflicts, past the creation of nations and the fall of temples, to a promise made under a canopy of Mesopotamian stars. A promise that would give birth to a people who would change the world, and in turn be forever changed by it. This is the story of an unbroken chain, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and a journey into the heart of one of the most influential and perhaps most misunderstood stories ever told. Our story begins not with a thunderous revelation, but with a quiet departure. Imagine a world saturated with gods. The sun was a god, the moon a goddess, the river, the harvest, the very stones beneath your feet, each pulsed with its own divine and often competing spirit. This was the world of ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, nearly 4,000 years ago. It was a world of magnificent ziggurats reaching for the heavens, each a staircase for a different deity. And in the bustling city of a man named Abram lived within this symphony of polytheism. The Bible tells us he was a simple man, but his journey was anything but. In a world that saw the divine in everything, Abram came to believe in the divine in one thing. Not a god of the mountain or a god of the sea, but the God of everything. A single, unseen, unknowable presence that was the source of all existence. This was an idea so radical, so profoundly countercultural, it was a philosophical earthquake. And this God, the story goes, spoke to him, not in a public spectacle, but in the intimacy of his own consciousness. The command was simple, yet terrifying. Go forth from your country, and from your kindred, and from your father's house, unto the land that I will show you. Think of the courage that must have taken, to abandon everything you know, your home, your culture, your family, your entire understanding of the cosmos, for a voice, a promise. God promised to make of him a great nation, to bless him, and to make his name great. This was the birth of the covenant, a pact, a sacred agreement that would become the central pillar of Jewish identity. It was not a contract of equals. It was a bond between the infinite and the finite, a promise that would ask everything of Abram and his descendants, and in return offer them a destiny. Abram, who would become Abraham, meaning father of many, set out on his journey. With his wife Sarai, later Sarah, he journeyed to a land called Canaan. This wasn't a military conquest, it was a nomadic wandering, an act of pure faith. This land, this promised land, would become the focal point of Jewish longing and identity for the next 4 millennia. It was not just a piece of real estate, it was the physical space where the spiritual covenant was meant to unfold. This foundational story tells us everything about the essential nature of Judaism. It is, at its core, about a relationship, a difficult, demanding, often strained relationship between a people and their God. It's also a story about being different, about choosing a separate path. From the very beginning, to be part of this covenant was to be set apart, to march to the beat of a different drum in a world that often viewed that difference with suspicion and sometimes with lethal hostility. Abraham was the first to take that step, to leave the comfort of the familiar for the uncertainty of a divine promise. And in that single act of faith, he laid the first stone of a spiritual edifice that would endure for ages. Generations passed. Abraham's descendants, the Israelites, found themselves not as a great nation in Canaan, but as slaves in the mighty empire of Egypt. The promise seemed broken, the covenant forgotten, buried under the weight of bricks and the sting of the taskmaster's whip. A people's spirit can be crushed in bondage. Memory fades, hope withers. This was the crucible in which the next chapter of their identity would be forged, not in comfort, but in suffering. And from this suffering, a leader emerged. A man raised in the very house of Pharaoh, yet whose heart beat with the blood of the enslaved. His name was Moses. The story of Moses is one of the great epics of human history. The burning bush, the plagues that humbled an empire, the defiant cry to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." But the true heart of the story isn't the escape, it's the journey that followed. The Exodus was not a simple march to freedom. It was a 40-year wandering through the harsh, unforgiving wilderness of the Sinai desert. This desert was a place of testing, of purification. It was here, stripped of everything, that the Israelites had to learn to depend on nothing but their God and each other. And it was here, at the foot of a thunderous Mount Sinai, that the covenant was renewed and given its eternal form. God did not just promise Abraham a destiny, He gave Moses a law, the Torah. These were not just rules, they were the architecture of a new kind of society, a blueprint for a nation. The 10 Commandments, etched in stone, were its foundation, a radical moral code that established the sanctity of life, family, and justice, all under the authority of the one God. This moment at Sinai is the defining event in Judaism. It transformed a tribe of escaped slaves into a nation bound by a shared moral purpose. The law was their constitution, their identity. It dictated how they would worship, how they would treat each other, how they would eat, and how they would live. It was a portable homeland. As long as they had the Torah, they were Israel, whether they had a land or not.
This covenant in the desert was profoundly different from the one made with Abraham. It was more demanding, more detailed. It came with responsibilities, with consequences. It established a framework of divine justice, but it also carried within it the seeds of an eternal struggle, the struggle of a human community to live up to a divine ideal. The golden calf incident, where the people lost faith and worshipped an idol even as Moses was receiving the law, is not just a footnote, it is a central part of the story, a reminder of the fragility of faith and the constant tension between the divine calling and human weakness. The desert was not just a place on a map, it was the spiritual landscape where a people were broken down and remade, forever bound to a law received in fire and thunder. So what is this Torah that was received at Sinai? To the outside world, it is often seen as the Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But in Judaism, the Torah is so much more than a book. It is a living, breathing entity. The word Torah itself means to teach or to guide. It is the central, unchangeable text, the very word of God. But it is not a silent text. For millennia, the Jewish people have been in conversation with this text, and that conversation is called the Talmud. If the Torah is a series of beautiful foundational islands, the Talmud is the vast, deep, and sometimes turbulent ocean that surrounds them. It is a colossal collection of writings compiled over centuries, documenting the relentless debates and interpretations of generations of rabbis. To read the Talmud is to witness a unique form of spiritual and intellectual devotion. It is not a book of easy answers, it is a book of arguments. On a single page, you will find a law from the Torah, followed by the opinion of one rabbi, challenged by another, supported by a story from a third, and then questioned again by a rabbi who lived centuries later. It is a multi-generational debate captured on paper, where no question is too small, no detail too insignificant. Why does the law say this? What does this word truly mean? What are the ethical implications in this specific situation? This process reveals the soul of rabbinic Judaism. God gave the law, but He gave humans the intellect to wrestle with it, to apply it, to make it relevant to their lives in every generation. This is not a faith of blind obedience. It is a faith of active engagement, of questioning, of seeking to understand the divine will through human reason and debate. It is this tradition that has kept Judaism from becoming a fossilized relic. It is an intellectual engine that has powered Jewish thought for 2,000 years. The Torah contains 613 commandments, or mitzvot. These are not seen as burdensome rules, but as opportunities to connect with God in every aspect of daily life. They cover everything from the highest moral principles, like love your neighbor as yourself, to the minute details of daily existence, what foods are permissible, kashrut, how to observe the Sabbath, how to conduct business, and how to resolve legal disputes. The Sabbath, or Shabbat, is a perfect example. From Friday sunset to Saturday night, the world of work and creation stops. It is a weekly island in time, a sanctuary dedicated to family, community, study, and rest, a reminder that we are more than what we produce. Keeping kosher, the dietary laws, is another. It transforms the simple act of eating into a conscious act of mindfulness and identity. Each law, each ritual, is a thread in a rich tapestry designed to weave the sacred into the fabric of the mundane. This is the genius of the Torah and Talmud. They provide a way for a people to live a holy life, not in a monastery, but in the midst of the world. After 40 years in the desert, the Israelites finally entered the promised land of Canaan. The period that followed was one of consolidation and eventually glory. The loose confederation of 12 tribes came to desire what all nations had, a king. This was a contentious idea. The prophet Samuel warned them that a king would tax them, conscript their sons, and lead them astray. He argued that God alone should be their king, but the people insisted. And so began the era of the kingdom. First, King Saul, a tragic figure. Then King David, the shepherd boy who slew Goliath, a brilliant warrior, a poet, and a deeply flawed but beloved king who unified the nation and made Jerusalem its capital. It was David who dreamed of building a permanent home for God, a central temple that would be the heart of the nation's spiritual life. That dream was realized by his son, Solomon. Renowned for his wisdom, Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem. It was, by all accounts, a magnificent structure, a marvel of gold, cedar, and stone. But it was more than just a beautiful building. The temple was the axis mundi, the center of the Jewish cosmos. It was the only place on earth where God's presence was believed to dwell most intensely. Here in the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, containing the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, was housed. Here the high priest would enter once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, to seek forgiveness for the entire nation. The daily life of the kingdom revolved around this temple. Pilgrims would stream to Jerusalem for the major festivals, bringing their sacrifices, their hopes, and their prayers. It was the physical anchor of the covenant, a permanent, glorious testament to the pact between God and Israel. This was the Golden Age. Under Solomon, the kingdom was powerful, prosperous, and at peace. But the prophet's warnings had not been forgotten. Solomon, for all his wisdom, was also a man of worldly appetites. He made political alliances with foreign nations, married foreign wives, and allowed their idols to be brought into the land. The seeds of division were sown. After Solomon's death, the kingdom fractured. The northern tribes broke away to form the kingdom of Israel, while the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to David's line, forming the kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital. This division was a deep spiritual wound. The two kingdoms were often at odds, sometimes even at war. The unity that David had forged was shattered. Throughout this period of kings and kingdoms, another set of powerful voices emerged: the prophets. Men like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Amos. They were not fortune-tellers. They were social critics, moral firebrands, and divine messengers. They spoke truth to power, railing against the corruption of the kings, the greed of the rich, and the empty rituals of a people who honored God with their lips but whose hearts were far from Him. Their words were often ignored, but they would echo through the centuries, a constant reminder of the moral demands of their faith.
The warnings of the prophets became a terrible reality. In the 8th century BCE, the mighty Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom Israel. Its people, the so-called 10 lost tribes, were deported and scattered, effectively vanishing from history. The southern kingdom of Judah held on for another century and a half, but its fate was sealed. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar did what seemed unthinkable. They conquered Jerusalem, plundered its treasures, and utterly destroyed Solomon's magnificent temple. The Ark of the Covenant disappeared, never to be seen again. The king, the priests, the scribes, the artisans, the entire elite of Judean society were forcibly marched into exile in Babylon. It is almost impossible to overstate the trauma of this event. This was not just a military defeat. It was a theological catastrophe. The temple, the house of God, was gone. The land, the gift of the covenant, had been lost. The Davidic king, the symbol of the eternal pact, was a captive. The central question that haunted the exiles was a devastating one. Had God abandoned them? Or worse, had their God been defeated by the gods of Babylon? Everything they had built, everything they had believed in, lay in ruins. This could have been the end of the story. Like so many other ancient peoples conquered by empires, they could have assimilated, forgotten their language, their God, their identity, and simply faded away. But they didn't. Something remarkable happened in the crucible of exile. Deprived of their land and their temple, the Jewish people were forced to find a new way to be Jewish. They could no longer offer sacrifices, so they turned to prayer. They could no longer make pilgrimages to a central shrine, so they created small sanctuaries wherever they were. This was the birth of the synagogue, the house of assembly. The scribes and scholars, led by prophets like Ezekiel, began the monumental task of gathering, editing, and canonizing their sacred texts. The stories, the laws, the prophecies that had once been part of an oral tradition were now written down, becoming the Hebrew Bible. The text became their temple. The study of Torah became their form of worship. In Babylon, they learned to be a nation in spirit, even when they were not a nation in geography. They maintained their traditions, their dietary laws, their observance of the Sabbath. These practices became markers of identity, ways of preserving their distinctiveness in a foreign land. They were no longer Judeans, people of a specific place, Judah. They became Jews, a people defined by their faith, regardless of where they lived. This transformation was one of the most pivotal moments in their history. It created a Judaism that was resilient, adaptable, and portable. It gave them the spiritual tools to survive not just one exile, but centuries of dispersal. The tears they shed by the rivers of Babylon watered the seeds of a new kind of survival, one based not on power or territory, but on the indestructible power of memory, text, and community. The physical temple was gone, but in its place, they built an invisible one that no army could ever destroy. After 50 years in exile, the political landscape shifted once again. The Babylonians were conquered by the Persian Empire, and its enlightened king, Cyrus the Great, issued a decree that stunned the ancient world. The Jews were free to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This return was not a triumphant flood, but a slow, arduous trickle. Many Jews had built lives in Babylon and chose to stay. But for a dedicated remnant, the call of their ancestral homeland was irresistible. Under the leadership of figures like Ezra and Nehemiah, they returned to a city that was a shadow of its former self. The task ahead was daunting. They rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, and on the sacred site of Solomon's temple, they constructed a new, more modest sanctuary, the Second Temple. The glory of the first was gone, the Ark of the Covenant was lost, but the sacrificial rituals were restored. Once again, Jerusalem was the center of Jewish spiritual life. Ezra the scribe led a national renewal, gathering the people and reading the Torah to them, solidifying its place as the constitution of the restored community. For several centuries, Judea existed as a small, semi-autonomous province under the rule of larger empires, first the Persians, then the Greeks after the conquests of Alexander the Great. The arrival of Greek culture, Hellenism, presented a new and insidious challenge. It was not a threat of destruction, but one of seduction. Greek philosophy, art, sport, and language were dazzlingly attractive. Many Jews, particularly the upper classes, began to assimilate, adopting Greek customs and ideas. This cultural clash led to a fierce internal struggle. A line was drawn between those who embraced Hellenism and those who saw it as a mortal threat to their faith. The tension erupted into violence in the 2nd century BCE when the Greek ruler Antiochus Epiphanes attempted to outlaw Jewish practices and desecrated the temple by sacrificing a pig on its altar. This outrage sparked a rebellion led by a family of priests known as the Maccabees. Against all odds, this small band of Jewish guerrilla fighters defeated the mighty Greek army, reclaimed Jerusalem, and rededicated the temple. This victory, commemorated to this day in the festival of Hanukkah, secured a brief period of Jewish independence under the Hasmonean dynasty. But this independence was short-lived. Internal strife and civil war weakened the kingdom, leaving it vulnerable to the next great power rising in the west, Rome. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey marched into Jerusalem, and Judea was a client state of the ever-expanding Roman Empire. The Roman occupation created a volatile and fragmented society. Different Jewish sects vied for influence. The Sadducees, the priestly aristocracy, collaborated with the Romans to maintain their power. The Pharisees, scholars beloved by the common people, focused on the interpretation of the law. The Essenes sought spiritual purity by withdrawing into the desert, and the Zealots preached armed rebellion, believing that only through violence could they cast off the Roman yoke. It was into this powder keg of political oppression, religious fervor, and messianic expectation that a Jewish carpenter from the Galilee named Jesus of Nazareth would be born. The presence of Roman legions in the Holy Land was a constant source of friction. Roman taxes were crippling, Roman rule was brutal, and the presence of pagan symbols in the holy city of Jerusalem was an ongoing insult. The Zealots' calls for rebellion grew louder, tapping into a deep well of resentment and a fervent belief that God would intervene to deliver his people. In the year 66 CE, the simmering tensions exploded into the Great Jewish Revolt. It began with early successes, as Jewish rebels drove out the Romans from Jerusalem. But the full might of the Roman war machine was soon brought to bear. The emperor sent his best general Vespasian and his son Titus with tens of thousands of legionaries to crush the rebellion.
What followed was 4 years of unimaginable bloodshed and horror. The historian Josephus, an eyewitness, described a land ravaged by war, famine, and brutal crucifixions. The final act played out in Jerusalem. The city, packed with pilgrims for Passover, was besieged by Titus's legions. After a brutal siege that starved the population into submission, the Romans breached the walls. In the year 70 CE, on the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, the very same date that the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, the Roman soldiers stormed the Temple Mount. They looted the sanctuary and set it ablaze. The Second Temple, the center of Judaism for 600 years, was reduced to a smoldering ruin. Josephus wrote that the flames were so high and the noise so great, the echo was heard from miles, a final agonizing scream from a dying nation. The destruction of the Second Temple was an even greater cataclysm than the first. It was the definitive end of the Jewish national and religious life centered in Judea. Hundreds of thousands were killed, and countless more were sold into slavery, scattered across the Roman Empire. The Arch of Titus, which still stands in Rome today, depicts the victory parade, with Roman soldiers carrying the spoils of the temple, including the great golden menorah. It was a monument to a nation's humiliation. And yet, once again, this was not the end. In the wake of the devastation, a small group of Pharisaic rabbis, led by a visionary named Yochanan ben Zakkai, understood that Judaism itself had to be reinvented to survive. They established a new center of learning in the town of Yavne. Here, they made a series of revolutionary decisions. With the temple gone, they decreed that acts of loving kindness and intensive prayer and study would now be the equivalent of sacrifice. They finalized the canon of the Hebrew Bible and laid the final, critical groundwork for the compilation of the Talmud. They created a portable, adaptable Judaism that did not depend on a place, a priest, or a king. It depended only on a community, a text, and a set of shared practices. This rabbinic Judaism became the lifeline that would sustain the Jewish people through nearly 2,000 years of exile, the Great Scattering, the Diaspora. They were now a people of the book in the truest sense, carrying their entire civilization with them wherever they were driven. The long exile of the Diaspora was not a monolithic experience. In the vast territories, now governed by Christianity and the newly risen faith of Islam, the fate of the Jewish people varied dramatically. In much of Christian Europe, their existence was precarious, a life lived in what has been called a golden cage. As the only significant non-Christian minority, Jews were often tolerated for their economic utility. Forbidden from owning land, they were pushed into professions like trade and moneylending, a practice forbidden to Christians but necessary for the economy. This often made them successful, but that success bred resentment and envy. They were seen as the other, the outsiders who had rejected Christ. This theological hostility fueled centuries of persecution. They were accused of outlandish crimes, the blood libel, a horrific lie that they used the blood of Christian children to make Passover matzah. They were blamed for plagues and misfortunes. Periodically, this hatred would erupt into violent pogroms, organized massacres that would sweep through Jewish communities. They were forced to live in segregated areas, which in the 16th century in Venice became known as ghettos. They were often forced to wear distinctive clothing to mark them as different. It was a life of constant uncertainty, where periods of relative peace could be shattered in an instant by a wave of religious fanaticism or the whims of a local ruler. But across the Mediterranean, in lands under Islamic rule, a different story unfolded. While still considered dhimmi, a protected but second-class people, Jews in the Islamic world often experienced a level of tolerance and opportunity unimaginable in Christian Europe. This was especially true during the Golden Age of Spain, or Al-Andalus, from the 8th to the 12th centuries. Here, under Muslim rule, Jewish life flourished in an extraordinary cultural symbiosis. Jewish thinkers writing in Arabic became masters of philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. They translated Greek classics, preserving knowledge that had been lost to Europe. The philosopher Maimonides, one of the most towering figures in Jewish history, wrote his monumental The Guide for the Perplexed in Cordoba, attempting to reconcile biblical faith with Aristotelian reason. Poets like Yehuda Halevi wrote some of the most beautiful Hebrew verse ever composed. This was a world of intellectual ferment where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars interacted and debated. But this golden age also had its limits. It too eventually ended with the rise of more fundamentalist Islamic dynasties and the Christian Reconquista of Spain, which culminated in 1492 with the expulsion of all Jews who refused to convert to Christianity.
The dual experiences of the diaspora, the persecution in Christian lands and the flourishing in Islamic ones, shaped the Jewish psyche in profound ways. It fostered a deep intellectual tradition, a reliance on community, and a powerful sense of resilience. But it also instilled a deep-seated sense of vulnerability, a knowledge that their existence was always contingent, always dependent on the tolerance of the surrounding majority. They were a people living in a house that was not their own, a house whose doors could be barred or whose walls could be set ablaze at any moment. While Rabbinic Judaism, with its focus on law and text, was the mainstream that kept the community anchored, another, more hidden stream was flowing just beneath the surface. A tradition of mysticism, of seeking a direct, personal, and ecstatic experience of the divine. This tradition is known as Kabbalah. The word Kabbalah means that which is received, suggesting a secret wisdom passed down from master to disciple. Its roots are ancient, with traces in the visions of the biblical prophets, but it truly blossomed in the medieval period, particularly among the Jewish communities of Spain and Provence. Kabbalah is not a separate religion, it is the esoteric soul of Judaism. While the Talmudic scholar seeks to understand God's will through the study of his law, the Kabbalist seeks to understand God's very nature, to map the hidden architecture of the divine reality and humanity's place within it. At the heart of Kabbalah is the idea that the Torah is not just a story or a set of laws, but a coded, mystical document. Every letter, every word, every punctuation mark holds layers of secret meaning. The Kabbalists developed complex systems of interpretation to unlock these secrets, believing that the Torah was a blueprint for creation itself.
Perhaps the most famous Kabbalistic text is the Zohar, the Book of Splendor. Written in a dense, poetic Aramaic, it presents itself as a record of the mystical discussions of the 2nd century sage, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and his disciples as they wandered through the Galilee. The Zohar describes a rich, dynamic inner life of God. It speaks of the Sephirot, 10 divine emanations or attributes through which the infinite, unknowable God interacts with the world. These are not 10 gods, but 10 facets of the one God, like wisdom, understanding, mercy, judgment, and beauty. The entire universe, in this view, is a reflection of these divine energies. Kabbalah teaches that the universe is broken. In the process of creation, a catastrophe occurred, the shattering of the vessels, which scattered sparks of divine light throughout the material world. Humanity's sacred task, through prayer and the performance of the mitzvot, is to gather these scattered sparks and restore cosmic harmony. This is the concept of tikkun olam, the healing or repair of the world. Every righteous act, no matter how small, is not just a personal good deed, it is an act of cosmic significance, helping to mend the fabric of creation. This mystical tradition offered a profound sense of meaning and purpose to a people living in a world that often seemed chaotic and unjust. It empowered them. In a world where they were powerless politically, Kabbalah taught that their spiritual actions had the power to affect the heavens and bring about redemption. It provided a deep spiritual counterbalance to the legalistic focus of mainstream Judaism, offering a path to intimacy with God in a universe filled with hidden light waiting to be revealed. For centuries, Jewish life, whether in the ghettos of Europe or the communities of the Middle East, had largely been insular. The walls of the ghetto were both a prison and a shield, preserving a unique way of life, but cutting it off from the currents of the wider world. Then, in the 18th century, a new wind began to blow through Europe, the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment championed reason, individual liberty, and universal human rights. For the first time, thinkers and political leaders began to argue that Jews should be freed from their medieval restrictions and granted full citizenship. Napoleon as he marched across Europe, tore down the ghetto walls. Slowly, painstakingly, country by country, the process of Jewish emancipation began. This was a moment of incredible hope and opportunity. For the first time, Jews could attend secular universities, enter professions previously barred to them, and participate fully in the cultural and political life of their countries. They flocked to the cities, embracing this new world with fervor, and their contributions were immense. From science to music, from finance to philosophy, figures of Jewish origin like Einstein, Freud, and Mahler would come to define modern thought and culture. But this new freedom was a double-edged sword. It presented the most profound challenge to Jewish identity in nearly 2,000 years. The central question became, how can one be both a Jew and a modern citizen of a secular nation? If Judaism was a complete civilization with its own laws and culture, how could it fit into this new world? The pressure to assimilate was immense. To succeed, many felt they had to abandon their traditional dress, their dietary laws, their distinctiveness. Some went further, converting to Christianity to gain full social acceptance. Jewish identity, which had been a clear and all-encompassing reality, suddenly became a question, a choice, a problem to be solved. This crisis of identity sparked a revolution within Judaism itself. Different movements emerged, offering different answers to the challenge of modernity. In Germany, the Reform movement was born. It sought to modernize Judaism, to make it compatible with modern life. Services were shortened, conducted in the vernacular instead of Hebrew, and elements that seemed irrational or out of step with modern sensibilities were discarded. Reform Judaism emphasized the ethical teachings of the prophets over the ritual law of the Torah. In response to this radical change, the conservative movement arose. It sought a middle ground, embracing modern scholarship and adapting to new realities, while striving to conserve the essential elements of Jewish law and tradition. And the Orthodox movement reasserted the divine, unchanging nature of the Torah and the Talmud, arguing that Judaism must not compromise its principles to accommodate the fleeting fashions of the modern world. This fracturing of the once unified Jewish world continues to this day. The Enlightenment opened the door of the ghetto, but it forced every Jew to ask themselves, for the first time, what it truly meant to be a Jew in a world that no longer defined it for them. It was an age of unprecedented achievement and freedom, but also of profound spiritual anxiety and internal division. While the Enlightenment offered the promise of integration, a darker, more virulent ideology was taking root in the soil of Europe. The old religious anti-Judaism, which hated the Jew for their faith, began to mutate into something new and far more sinister, modern racial anti-Semitism, which hated the Jew for their very blood. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this new pseudo-scientific racism portrayed Jews not as followers of a different religion, but as a separate, inferior, and malevolent race. They were cast as the villains in a new set of paranoid fantasies, the secret manipulators of global finance, the masterminds of communist revolution, a corrupting influence on the purity of the national bloodline. Forged documents like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were circulated, spreading lies about a Jewish conspiracy for world domination. This poison found its most fertile ground in the chaos and humiliation of Germany after World War I. A failed artist and charismatic demagogue named Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party harnessed these deep-seated prejudices, blaming the Jews for all of Germany's problems. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they began to systematically strip Jews of their rights, their property, and their humanity. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 defined who was a Jew based on ancestry, making it an inescapable racial category. Jewish businesses were boycotted, Jewish books were burned, and Jewish people were barred from public life. On the night of November 9, 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, synagogues across Germany were torched, and Jewish homes and shops were destroyed in a nationwide pogrom. This was only the beginning. With the outbreak of World War II, the Nazis began to implement their final solution to the Jewish question. This was not just a plan for persecution or expulsion. It was a plan for the systematic, industrial-scale extermination of an entire people. From every corner of occupied Europe, Jews were rounded up, crammed into cattle cars, and transported to a network of death camps: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. This was the Holocaust. Here, the machinery of modern bureaucracy and technology was put to the service of pure, unadulterated evil. Men, women, and children were starved, worked to death, subjected to horrific medical experiments, or murdered in gas chambers.
It is a horror that defies language. 6 million Jews were murdered. 1.5 million of them were children. An entire civilization, the vibrant Yiddish-speaking world of Eastern Europe, with its rich culture, its scholars, its artists, its everyday families, was wiped from the face of the earth. The Holocaust is not just a Jewish tragedy, it is a human tragedy. It stands as an eternal warning of where the longest hatred can lead when it is combined with the power of a modern state and the indifference of the world. It is a wound on the soul of humanity, a testament to the depths of human depravity. And for the Jewish people, it was the ultimate test of the covenant, an encounter with an abyss of silence where the question, "Where was God?" echoed in the ashes of Auschwitz. It was the darkest night in their long history of nights. In the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, the survivors were a broken people. They were ghosts emerging from the camps, with nothing but the tattooed numbers on their arms and the memories of a world that had been turned to ash. Many had no homes to return to, no families left alive. They were displaced persons, adrift in a world that seemed to have no place for them. But out of this unimaginable devastation, an old dream, long dormant, was reignited with a desperate new urgency: the dream of Zionism. Zionism, the movement for the restoration of a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel, had begun in the late 19th century. It was a response to the failures of emancipation and the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. Its founders, like Theodor Herzl, argued that as long as the Jewish people were a homeless minority, they would never be safe. Only in their own sovereign state could they finally be masters of their own destiny. For decades, Zionism was a fringe movement. But the Holocaust changed everything. It proved, in the most brutal way imaginable, that Herzl's darkest fears were justified. The cry, "Never again," became the driving force of the survivors. The only way to ensure their survival was to return home. Thousands of survivors made the perilous journey to what was then British-controlled Palestine, determined to build a new life. The international community, reeling from the revelations of the death camps, was finally moved to act. In 1947, the United Nations voted to partition the land into 2 states, one Arab and one Jewish. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish community, stood in Tel Aviv and declared the establishment of the State of Israel. It was a moment of sheer, unadulterated ecstasy. After 2,000 years of wandering, of exile, of persecution, the Jewish people once again had a home. The prophecy was fulfilled, the hope that had been whispered in prayers for centuries, next year in Jerusalem, had become a reality. But this rebirth was not without its own pain. The Declaration of Independence was met immediately by the invasion of 5 neighboring Arab armies. For the new state, and for the Palestinian Arabs who had been living on that land, it was the beginning of a new and tragic conflict that continues to this day. The birth of Israel, a dream realized for one people, became the Nakba, or catastrophe, for another.
The story of Israel is a story of incredible achievement. In just a few decades, they transformed a barren land into a thriving modern democracy, a powerhouse of technology and innovation. They absorbed waves of Jewish immigrants from all over the world, from Europe, from the Arab lands, from Ethiopia, forging a new, vibrant Hebrew culture. The founding of Israel is the single most transformative event in Jewish history since the destruction of the Second Temple. It recentered the Jewish world, providing an anchor of sovereignty and power after millennia of powerlessness. It was a defiant act of life in the face of death, a phoenix rising quite literally from the ashes of Europe. It did not solve all the problems of Jewish existence, and it created new, painful dilemmas. But it was a profound statement that the long, dark night of exile was finally over. To truly understand Judaism, we must look at the branches that grew from its ancient trunk, for it is the parent of two other great monotheistic faiths that have shaped our world: Christianity and Islam. Together they are known as the Abrahamic religions, and they share a common spiritual ancestry. Christianity was born as a Jewish sect. Jesus was a Jew. He lived as a Jew, he taught as a Jew, and he preached to Jews in the Jewish homeland. His disciples were all Jews. They prayed in the temple, they read the Torah. The moral framework of Jesus' teachings, love of God, love of neighbor, is rooted directly in Jewish scripture. The Old Testament of the Christian Bible is, in fact, the Hebrew Bible. For the first followers of Jesus, he was the Jewish Messiah, the one foretold by the Hebrew prophets. The split came later, as the message of Jesus began to spread to non-Jews, the Gentiles. The Apostle Paul, in a revolutionary move, argued that followers of Christ did not need to convert to Judaism or follow the entirety of Jewish law. This decision opened the faith to the entire Roman world and set Christianity on its own distinct path. Over time, theological differences hardened, particularly over the nature of Jesus himself. What began as a family argument within Judaism evolved into two separate religions, a relationship that would tragically be marked by centuries of Christian persecution of its parent faith. Centuries later, in the 7th century CE, another prophet arose in the deserts of Arabia. His name was Muhammad. The religion he founded, Islam, also saw itself as a restoration of the pure original monotheism of Abraham. Muslims, like Jews, believe in one indivisible God, Allah. They share many of the same prophets: Adam, Noah, Moses, Musa, and Jesus, Isa, are all revered figures in Islam. The Quran, the holy book of Islam, is filled with stories that are familiar to anyone who has read the Hebrew Bible. Islam, too, has its own set of divine laws, Sharia, which, like Jewish halakha, governs many aspects of daily life. Practices like dietary restrictions and the prohibition of graven images echo Jewish traditions. Jerusalem is the third holiest city in Islam, the site from which the Prophet Muhammad is believed to have ascended to heaven. For centuries, this shared heritage allowed for periods of fruitful coexistence and intellectual exchange. But like the relationship with Christianity, it has also been marked by conflict and misunderstanding.
Yet to ignore these common roots is to miss a fundamental truth about our world. More than half of the human population today belongs to a faith that traces its spiritual lineage back to that one man, Abraham, and his radical idea of a single God. They are, in a very real sense, the children of Abraham. They worship the same God, though they call him by different names. They share a foundational story of creation, revelation, and redemption. And they are all grappling with the same essential challenge: how to live a moral and meaningful life in accordance with the will of the one God who started it all with a whisper in the desert. In the modern world, what does it mean to be a Jew? There is no single answer. Judaism today is not a monolith. It is a vibrant, diverse, and often argumentative global family, a living civilization that is constantly evolving. Walk the streets of Tel Aviv and you will find a fiercely secular modern society. Young Israelis serve in the army, build startups, and argue about politics in cafes, their Jewish identity expressed through the Hebrew language, a shared national destiny, and a connection to the land. For many, their Judaism is more cultural and national than religious. Then, travel to the Mea Sha'arim neighborhood of Jerusalem, or to Brooklyn in New York. Here you will find the Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox Jews. They live in insular communities dedicated to a life of intense Torah study and strict adherence to Jewish law, much as their ancestors did centuries ago. For them, Judaism is an all-encompassing way of life with little compromise to the secular world outside. In a suburban American synagogue, you might find a Reform Jewish community where men and women pray together in English and Hebrew, where LGBTQ+ rabbis are welcomed, and where the focus is on social justice and ethical action, the principle of tikkun olam, healing the world. In the same city, a conservative synagogue might hold a more traditional service, striving to maintain the ancient rituals while adapting to modern life. Jewish identity is also expressed through a rich tapestry of cultural traditions. It's in the taste of food, the challah bread on Shabbat, the matzah on Passover, the Sephardic stews and Ashkenazi gefilte fish. It's in the sound of music, from the haunting melodies of klezmer to the sacred chants of the synagogue. It's in a shared sense of humor, often ironic and self-deprecating, born from centuries of being the outsider looking in. And the ancient tradition of debate continues with as much passion as ever. Jews argue about everything, about politics in Israel, about the role of women, about the nature of God, about what it means to be a good Jew. This intellectual dynamism, this refusal to settle for easy answers, remains one of the core characteristics of Jewish culture. To be a Jew today can mean so many different things. It can be a deep religious faith, it can be a connection to a national homeland, it can be a rich cultural inheritance, it can be a commitment to a set of ethical values, or it can be a combination of all these things. It is a family with many different voices, a tradition with many different paths. But what they all share, whether they know it or not, is a connection to a story that has been unfolding for 4,000 years. A story of covenant, of law, of exile, and of return. It is not a relic of the past. It is a living conversation, and every Jew today is a part of it. We began with a question of survival, and after this long journey through 4 millennia of history, what have we found? We have found a story of unparalleled resilience. A people who have endured exile, dispersion, persecution, and genocide, yet have not only survived, but have continued to contribute profoundly to the intellectual, spiritual, and moral life of humanity. So what is the secret? Is it the covenant, the sense of a divine mission, a chosen destiny that gave them a purpose even in their darkest hours? Is it the law, the Torah and the Talmud, that provided a portable homeland, a structure and an identity that could not be taken away? Is it their relentless emphasis on education, on questioning, on wrestling with the great ideas that kept their culture dynamic and alive? Perhaps it is all of these things, and perhaps it is something more. Perhaps the story of the Jewish people is a mirror reflecting the most extreme possibilities of the human condition. It reflects our capacity for breathtaking faith and our capacity for devastating doubt. It reflects our ability to create transcendent beauty and our ability to commit unspeakable evil. It is a story of chosenness and of persecution, of divine love and of divine silence. The ultimate legacy of Judaism may not be a set of answers, but a set of profound and enduring questions. What is our responsibility to each other? What is the nature of justice? How do we find meaning in suffering? How do we keep hope alive in a broken world? These are not just Jewish questions. They are human questions. The story that began with Abraham gazing at the stars is, in the end, a story about looking up. It is about believing that there is a meaning to our existence that transcends the here and now. It is about holding on to a memory of a promise and a hope for a redemption that is yet to come. It is about the sacred duty of tikkun olam, the belief that we are partners with God in the work of creation, and that it is our job to mend the world's fractures, to gather its scattered sparks of light. To understand this story is not to solve a mystery, but to stand before one in awe. It is to recognize the fragile yet unbreakable power of the human spirit. And perhaps it is to find within this ancient and particular story a universal truth that to live is to remember, to hope is to repair, and to love is to choose again and again to be part of a story that is larger than ourselves.